That's the headline inflation going in concluding that is doing well. And then also in terms of the program itself, we are achieving certain targets. Food inflation, even though it's reduced by 8%, is still very high. Why is this the case? And especially in these food growing areas. We'll talk about it this evening here on Business Focus. Also ahead, where we will dissect the IMF bailout for Ghana, a lifeline crucial for the nation's economic stability, and the indispensable need for external creditors assurance to secure that much-awaited second tranche of $600 million from the Bretton Woods institution. Now, will this creditor assurance come at a cost? And if that's going to be the case, what kind of commitments will be expected of Ghana to have the external creditors give us that needed agreement for us to get the second tranche of the IMF bailout? Additionally, we'll shed light on the intricate dynamics of the cocoa syndicated loan. It's a financial endeavor essential to ensuring that Cocoa Board receives the necessary funds to sustain the industry currently facing a shortfall in targeted funding. So the cocoa syndicated loan is a big conversation as well this evening here on Business Focus. Stay tuned in for the in-depth analysis together with my guests who will be joining me shortly. I am Alfred Akonse. Welcome. Let's take a wrap of some of the business stories that made headlines for the last 24 hours.
In Business Today, Director of ISE, Professor Peter Korte, has stated the anticipated second tranche of the IMF bailout funds is expected to contribute to a more stable economy. He further mentioned the expected inflows would assist the government in carrying out essential expenditures. Ratings agency Fitch Solutions has predicted a roughly 1% strengthening of the Ghana cedi against the US dollar in 2024. This is expected to position the currency as one of Africa's top-performing currencies for the year. On the international front, major airlines around the world have cancelled flights to Israel or warned of travel disruption as the security situation deteriorates. Virgin Atlantic warned of cancellations and delays to Tel Aviv, and British Airways has altered its schedule. Meanwhile, 3 U.S. carriers, as well as Air France, Lufthansa and Emirates, have suspended services.
And you'll find more on 3news.com. Make some time and visit 3news.com. Now, on Friday, the finance minister, the governor of the central bank, and then also the IMF chef de mission, Stefan Rode, all addressed the press, giving updates on Ghana's progress under the IMF program. Now, according to the chef de mission of the IMF team to Ghana, there's been some progress made under the IMF program so far. I want to take a listen to Stefan Rode.
What makes us very optimistic is that these actions are already generating positive results. Growth in 2023 has proven more resilient than what we were initially envisaging. Inflation has declined. The fiscal and external positions have improved. International reserves are increasing again, and exchange rate volatility has significantly reduced. Once our executive board review is completed, Ghana would have access to another $600 million, bringing the total IMF financial support disbursed under the arrangement since May, when the program was approved, to about $1.2 billion.
Well, let's hear from the finance minister as well, Ken Ofori-Atta, on the progress made so far. And then the reference point to what the IMF is talking about, the money is expected, all things being equal, after the external creditors agreement.
External creditors, I believe we are doing well with regards to the engagement. Expected that this coming week we might actually get a proposal for them. Our target is to be able to conclude this thing before year end, and we are pursuing it. And I think achievements of the SLA also puts pressure on coming to faster resolution. So this achievement is important towards our negotiating stance going forward. The Paris Club common framework, MOU. Certainly, France and China continue to be very supportive.
Well, so that's the finance minister there. Now take a look at some of the pointers that they put out during that joint press conference, and we'll be joined shortly by Professor Peter Korte in a bit. But take a look at this. They say that program took off in May, and this review is ahead of the possible disbursements of the second tranche of $600 million in November, all things being equal. That is, if a board approval is secured, that's what has to happen. Now, and then also we are waiting for what's going to happen with the external creditors engagement. Now, Ghana's performance, according to Stefan Rode, under the program has been very strong. Reduction in deficit achieved, and Ghana on course to lower this by some 4% of GDP. Now, Ghana has also met an oil revenue mobilization target for June 2023. All of these, bear in mind, are macroeconomic targets. Now, government spending is within program spending limit. Social protection program expanded to protect impact of program on the vulnerable. And monetary policy appropriately tightened. All these macroeconomic targets the IMF has been making reference to. But we'll find out what was done to even achieve this, and at what cost that it came, especially for the Ghanaian people. Now, you see the Bank of Ghana's position as well, presented by Dr. Addison, the governor of the central bank. It says that non-food inflation dropped by 90%, food inflation declined by 8%. And it is this food inflation aspect of his presentation that we're going to be spending some time on here on Business Focus. Now, Bank of Ghana has also built reserves of about $650 million from the beginning of the year, instead of the program's drawdown of $98 million. Professor Peter Korte is the Dean and also the Director of the Institute of Statistical, Social and Economic Research, ISE, at the University of Ghana, Legon. I thank you so much, Professor Peter Korte, for joining us here on Business Focus. Now, you heard the finance minister there that the IMF's review shows that Ghana's economy has achieved stability. Would you say that stability in itself has been achieved, as the finance minister is saying, because of the IMF's assessment of the progress made under the program so far?
Well, I think we've made progress, but I won't say we have achieved stability in the sense that where we even find inflation is not the desired level. Inflation is still very high compared to our peers. GDP growth, yes, we've seen some improvement. The last 2 quarters of 2023 shows we're growing around 3%, and we are likely to achieve same by end of year. Exchange rate has been relatively stable, so we see the fiscal. But I think it's early days yet for us to celebrate. So I don't think we are on the path towards achieving stability, but I don't think we've reached the point where we can confidently say we've achieved stability.
But I see, you see, some level of macroeconomic stability has been achieved. That's at least per the indicators that I put out earlier and what the IMF itself has captured in their statement. You see some level of some macroeconomic targets being ticked there. But you would concede also, Professor Peter Korte, that this progress has come at an extreme cost to the Ghanaian people, is it not? Making very huge sacrifices under this domestic debt exchange program, the high inflation rate, high interest rate that we've seen over the period, isn't it?
You're very much right. It's come at a very high cost to Ghanaians. The painful debt exchange program has caused a lot of people to lose income. Some livelihood have been severely affected. Some businesses have gone down as a result of all these restructuring processes. It's come at a cost to even the country and to everybody. So it's really been a big challenge. Even if you look at real incomes, people's real income have all come down or reduced. If you look at the rate of inflation and look at how much, consider match it against um, increases in wages, we can say that real wages have declined, and by extension, livelihood. So it's really come at a cost to everybody.
But has there been a corresponding action on the part of government? Because you have considered that indeed this macroeconomic targets that have been achieved under this program so far has come at an extreme cost to the Ghanaian people and the sacrifices under the domestic debt exchange program. But how about any corresponding action on the part of government, tangible, visible actions like cutting down of critical expenditure, which some of you proposed as well?
Yeah, we've seen in the 2023 budgets some attempts to reduce government spending, including travel, trying to use the gift system to streamline operations. Now, some effort have been made to reduce spending, but I can't confidently say uh, it's optimal because we have not been given the numbers to show how directly these policies have led to a reduction in government spending. Uh, Besides, if you look at government expenditure, it's not going down, it's rather increasing, except that we're also increasing revenue. But in an austere times, you will see a considerable reduction in government expenditure. But I don't think I found that in our mid-year budget uh, statement that government spending has come down. It is revenue has gone up, and that has minimized or reduced the deficit.
I see. But, Prof, you see, we talk about some of the indicators of reference that the IMF use, inflation, interest rate, the stability of the city, all of these which we're going to be interrogating as we go on. But you see, if you look at inflation, headline inflation has gone down, as compared to, say, December last year. But then again, food inflation, even though has reduced by 8%, is still very, very high. Now, if you look at the food inflation in some of the food growing areas, like the Northeast region, the Eastern region, the Western region, they are even higher than the food inflation in the Greater Accra region. This is where food is grown. This should be concerning, is it not?
Worrying. I mean, it's quite surprising and shocking to see inflation sometimes even higher than in Accra, food inflation higher than you will find in Accra. Also because um, in some of the crops we are not producing enough, and we tend to depend on imported items. And most of the imported food items will find their way in Accra and the major cities. So in the food growing areas, that becomes a problem. And also, most of these farmers rely on their sale of crops, etc., to finance other expenditures like oil and fish and meat and other things. So even though they are producing, they tend to sell a good proportion in order to finance their expenditures, non-food expenditures. So all of this accounts for the high food inflation in the regions, which is very worrying to say the least, because we have always thought that rural poverty is less severe compared to urban poverty because food is in abundance. So even when you are poor, you don't have a place to sleep. At least you find food available. But we are seeing the reverse, where food prices are rather on the increase in the rural areas and in the regions than you find in Accra and other major cities.
So what has to be done, in your view, to sustain these gains that have been made under this program so far?
I think, well, the monetary policy, we're using monetary policy very well to mop up excess liquidity, but that has a limit. You cannot use one tool to fight two or three problems. I think we have to look at the fiscal. How do we channel policy? How do we channel resources into the productive areas? Uh, some investments into agric, into irrigation, into processing, into value addition, into seeds. Very important if we really want to tackle inflation in the real sector, food inflation, etc. We've also seen that construction, for instance, is had recorded a negative growth rate. If you look at the second quarter GDP figures, and if you trace this down, you realize government is not paying contractors on time, and that is really hurting the sector. You'll also find that manufacturing, one of the major employers of labor force, recorded low or negative growth rates during the period, and that calls for action. The cost of doing business has increased. Taxes have gone up. Cost of utilities have gone up. So these are areas where we can try and ensure that cost of doing business is minimized or kept at bay if we are to promote manufacturing.
Much for joining us here on Business Focus. Is the director of the Institute of Social Security, and that's the Social Economic Research and at the University of Ghana, Legon, joining us here. Professor Peter Korte, appreciate your time. Thank you so much for your thoughts here. But let's look at the inflation rate now, and then also how this is impacting on the current conversation that we're having. Food inflation was 51.9%, and then that was as at last month. Food inflation was about 55%. And then month-on-month inflation, we've seen a reduction between July and August by some 0.3%. Now, the focus is on food inflation, though, because if you heard the governor of the central bank talk about food inflation reducing by 8% since the beginning of the year, but it is still very high, 51.9%. And we will do a breakdown, a regional breakdown of the inflation. You see there, at least if you look at the month-on-month inflation, at least between January and now, from 53.6% to in January to 52.8% in February, March 45%, in April 41.2%, then in May inched up a bit to 42.2%, and then in June 42.5%, 43.1% in July, and then 40.1% in August. This is the headline inflation. But if you drill down, you see something very worrying happening with respect to food inflation. And we would have Dr. Charles Nyaba joining us as we go on in a bit to speak to why the food inflation is high in some of these food growing areas. Now, this is quite worrying to say the least. And Dr. Charles Nyaba will be joining us shortly. Stay with us. We'll be back shortly after this quick break. This is Business Focus here on TV3. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Business Focus. We're live on TV3 Ghana on Facebook, DSTV channel 279, all across the world on 3news.com. Now, although the headline inflation has gone down, at least between January and now, as we put out earlier, food inflation, though it's reduced by 8%, is still high on the market. If you go to the market to buy food items, you still see that even though we were in the harvesting season, the prices of food items still high. The Northeast region is a food growing area where food is grown and transported to down south here in Accra for us to buy. Look at the food inflation in the Northeast region, 85.5%. In the Eastern region, 70.4% food inflation. Bono region, 63.1%. The Northern region, 61.3%. In the Western region, 58.3%. And look at what's happening in the Northwestern North, 55.3%. Savannah follows in that same order. Bono East region had a food inflation of 49.9% in the month of August. And Volta region, 47.6%. In the OT region, 45.4%. The Greater Accra region comes in with 45.4% food inflation, Central region 44.7%, Ashanti region 43.3%, Upper East 42.9%, and the Ahafo region 36.9%. Now, question is, how come that we have the food inflation being higher in food growing areas like the Northeast region? And as we go on, we'll be slapping it on the screen. the Northeast region has a higher food inflation as compared to the Greater Accra region? Dr. Charles Nyaba is the Executive Director of the Peasant Farmers Association of Ghana. He's joining us on the telephone. Dr. Nyaba, thank you so much for joining us here on Business Focus. So what's accounting for this, that the food inflation in the Northeast region, where food is grown, is higher than food inflation in the Greater Accra region? What's happening?
Thank you, Alfred. Let me say good evening. I think it's been a while.
Indeed.
I just returned from the field about 3 days today. And I'm not surprised with what is happening. Generally, several factors determine prices of food that farmers put on the market. One, we have to look at cost of production. And then when we talk of cost of production, we are looking at input costs, we are looking at fuel, that those who use machinery and tractors, fuel, and then the charges they impose on farmers. We have to look at the total harvest at the area and the type of crops that are planted. When you take Northeast, for instance, it has happened because in recent times, if you go to Northeast, like places like Yarba, West Mampose, Kobangna, all those areas, you realize that we have a lot of foreign investors. Even I say foreign investors, not necessarily people outside Ghana, but people outside the region who went there and took large acreages of land to grow rice. And those people grow rice, they don't sell the rice there. They store the rice, and during the late season, they sell it in the urban areas. So Northeast region like this, growing of other crops like vegetables, tubers, maize, and other cereals is very, very limited. So the indigenous themselves have to depend on food that is imported from other regions like processed rice and then cooking oil to survive. So even though you see Northeast region as a food-growing area, this is expected because the type of crops that are grown there are not actually harvested and consumed in the area. Okay? Now, for the other regions where we are still experiencing higher food prices, this year in particular, after the planting for food and jobs phase 1 was phased out, and then the ministry was developing planting for food and jobs phase 2, the 2.0. The whole year, government has not spent a peso in supporting farmers in terms of subsidizing input, in terms of subsidizing mechanization services, in terms of investing in extension. So farmers are bearing full cost of production. And because of all this and then increase in fuel prices, cost of those inputs have gone up. So once the cost is gone up, when the farmer produce, they also push the cost on the consumer. So this is expected, and I don't think it's going to go down anytime soon.
I see. You project that the prices of food items that is in these food growing areas is not going to go down anytime soon.
Yeah, so if you look at this time run, many farmers are harvesting most of the crop. If you take a peanut, if you take those who did a major season maize, rice, we are yet to actually start harvesting rice. Those who did millet, cowpea, plantain, all these areas they are harvesting. Okay? So if prices are not down now, I don't expect that after the harvest is done, price is going to go down. Because if a farmer will even have to sell the price at a lower cost, it's a commodity that is perishable, and that farmer cannot store it. Because if you want to sell it at a lower cost, you will not cover your cost of production. Okay? So I'm not, because last week there was a price negotiation in the Bursa South for rice. And the prices that the buyers were proposing and the price the farmers were proposing, I was a witness to that. You realize that farmers were being realistic, even though the reason the buyers are also giving makes sense. But if farmers are to go by that, it means that the subsequent year they won't be able to produce because of cost of production.
I see. So this can be zeroed down to the cost of inputs, which has pushed up the prices of food items in these food growing areas.
Alfred, you are right. This year, for instance, if you take, let me just cite some few examples. If you take NPK fertilizer, I'll take one company for instance. If you take NPK fertilizer for Yara, for instance, it's going to between 460 Ghana cedis to 500 Ghana cedis, depending on the region. The same bag of fertilizer last year was going for around 400 Ghana cedis. When you take a pesticide, the common pesticide or weedicide, average price for last year was around 46 to 56. This year, in most places, it's going for 60 to 76. Okay? When you take a cost of mechanization service, plowing services, last year was going for around 200. This year, in many places, is going between 250 to 300 Ghana cedis. So once the farmer produces, the farmer will also factor all this into the total production cost for an acre, which we call a crop budget. So after doing that, if you divide, the farmer cannot sell it lower than a certain price, no matter the bumper harvest that that farmer would have recorded.
I see. Now, so what are the interventions, very briefly, do you expect that government would put in place to address this situation? Because even though headline inflation is reducing, as we have said, or declining, we are seeing food inflation, a critical factor in the inflation computation, also reducing, but not at that same rate. We're still buying food items high in price on the market.
Yeah, so our expectations are that the Planning for Food and Jobs PFJ 2.0 has just been launched. And I saw in many platforms, the government is advertising for people to express interest. So we are hoping that when that project is commenced fully, and then government come out with intervention that will cushion farmers against higher cost of production, for them to be able to even assess the inputs at the right time that it is needed, then farmers are likely to increase their production and the cost will come down. But leaving the total cost of production, not replacing everything to the farmer, obviously when the farmer produces, that farmer will have to sell at a certain price to remain in business.
I appreciate your time. Thank you so much. Dr. Charles Nyaba is Executive Director of the Peasant Farmers Association of Ghana. Thank you so much for joining us here on Business Focus. Now you take a look at this. We're still disaggregating the information put out by the IMF in making the conclusions about the progress that we've made under the program. We've had a conversation with Professor Peter Korte about the stability that the finance minister talks about, which he's raised questions of, but also the fundamental concern is about the policy rate as well. That's one of the indicators that the IMF also looked at, monetary policy, tightening monetary policy. The IMF said that has been done. Take a look at this. We track the policy rate over the period from October 2022, a year ago. The policy rate was 24.5%. That's the rate at which the Bank of Ghana lends to the various commercial banks. November, it increased to 27%. In January 2023, increased to 28%. March, 29.5%. In May, it was maintained. And in July, increased to 30%. In September, increased to, in fact, it was maintained to as at 30%. Now, if you look at this policy rate and compare it to the reference rate as well, and then also the rate at which the various commercial banks are applying to their loans, it ranges between 33 to 35%, and the private sector is heavily hit. Now, if you look at these three indicators, inflation, interest rate, cedi stability, that's part of the indicators that the IMF looked at. Joe Jackson is a financial analyst. He's joining us on Zoom for a quick conversation on this. Now, I'll start off with this particular issue of the stability of the cedi, the relative stability of the cedi between January and now. Mr. Jackson, thank you very much for joining us here on Business Focus. Now, one of the major indicators that the IMF looked at in assessing the state of the economy is the cedi, the relative stability of the cedi between January and now. Can this relative stability be pinned or attributed to any specific policy intervention that has been introduced or implemented between the period under review, that is January to date, from your own analysis, where you sit? Hello, Mr. Jackson. We'll rectify that connection with Joe Jackson shortly to seek his thoughts on this particular issue and also the analysis that the IMF took into consideration in making these proposals, and also the conclusions that have been made, and the concern about the external creditors as well, and how the agreement with the external creditors will play out eventually, especially because we do know that China has already, in the last few months, raised concerns about certain commitments that it is being asked to make, because they say that if the IMF expects them, as China, one of our biggest single creditors, to make certain concessions for us as a country, then the IMF as well, together with the World Bank, should also be willing to make same commitments. And that's where some analysts have raised concerns about the challenge that this will pose for our conversations with the external creditors as well, and especially how things are going to play out in the coming months going forward. We will deal with that shortly, and also take an understanding of how the engagement, especially the engagement with the external creditors, will be, and if we're going to make any commitments, how that would also impact on us. Mr. Jackson, thank you very much for joining us here on Business Focus. Now, with this relative stability we've seen with the cedi, can this be pinned to any specific policy intervention by government?
Yes, it can. And there's a very important policy intervention that took place in December of last year. As at 18th December last year, the government raised its hand and said, I can't pay any of my debts. I won't pay any more. I've defaulted. And I will remain in default until I can negotiate a new rate with you. And this is reference to the foreign debtors. Now, once this was done, the important thing was this. We stopped having to buy dollars to ship out to our creditors. And this has continued since last year and has been a really, really important reason why the dollar has stabilized up until now. The challenge is this. Just now, we are about to conclude with the foreign debtors and on the treatment. And that conclusion will very well mean that we will now go back and start paying our debts, which will now put pressure on the cedi. Because right now, remember, debt servicing is zero pressure on the cedi. Whatever we start paying, it will add some pressure to the cedi. That is the challenge. But has it been stable up to now? Yes. Has it been partly a result of a policy intervention? A big yes. Is there a huge risk that the cedi will experience some volatility in the days ahead? The answer also is a big yes. A number of things have happened. Number one is this. We're going to start paying. Number two is this. The fuel, the cost of fuel is our number one biggest import. The cost of fuel has been kind to Ghana up until date. The prices have remained relatively low. But now the prices are rising. And we've just seen an escalation in the Ukraine war, and a new war start in the Middle East. All these things serve to put pressure on oil prices. When you merge that with the winter cold season in the northern temperate zone, then you're going to have an increase in prices, which would hit us hard. So the cedi has been stable. And you must give credit to where credit is due. It was due to a policy intervention. But there are major risks ahead, and it is likely you're going to see a lot more volatility in the days ahead.
That's worrying, to say the least. A lot more volatility in the days ahead. So for you, essentially, the suspension of the servicing of our external debt contributed largely to the relative stability of the cedi we've seen?
It is one of the factors. It is one of the factors and a significant factor, I believe. There are other factors. Demand for the city has fallen because the crisis has meant that we are not buying as many imported goods as we used to. So that has already also put has helped the city to be stable, right? And so that is it definitely, that policy intervention definitely had an impact.
At least mitigate the impact of these risks that you project for the city.
Risk mitigant is a 600 million second tranche. Once that second tranche is coming, we have the biggest mitigant of all. If the second tranche does come on time, then we would have enough reserves to be able to maybe keep the city stable. But there are also other risks. We've talked about resuming the debt servicing for external debtors. We've talked about the price of fuel. There's also the fact that this year, it is likely we will not get cocoa yields and cocoa exports as high as previous years. You should note that the cocoa syndicated loan was maybe half or 40% of what it has been in previous years. That's not a good sign. So that means that the regular inflows we get in the third quarter and the fourth quarter from cocoa may not be coming. And so we should all be on the lookout for more volatility, more ups and downs in the price of the cedi in the months ahead of this quarter.
It is this cocoa syndicated loan matter that Mr. Jackson, you end on, that would lead us to our next conversation. The fact that the amount of inflows from the syndicated loan that we're expecting would not come in because we've got lesser than what we projected we're going to get. Joe Jackson is a financial analyst. Thank you so much. We're going to go for this quick break. When we're back, we're getting to the cocoa syndicated loan matter and the implications of this reduced money that we're getting from the loan as earlier projected. Stay with us. We'll be back shortly.